Hey, everybody. I hope that you are doing well. This week, we're continuing our study through the book of Titus and specifically the themes that we see through Titus, right? And one of the themes that we see, so last week we talked about identity. This week, we're going to talk about assignments. Now, assignments are different than identity because identity is about who you are. Assignments are about what God has called you to do. You know, one of the best practices that someone can have, and I've heard this from so many pastors over the year, so many people over the year, is to daily read through the book of Proverbs, a chapter a day, 31 chapters. Most months you get through the entire book. The ones that you don't, you read 30 and 31 together, except for February. Then you have to read a lot of then. But the book of Proverbs is it's a book of wisdom. It's a book about how do we trust and follow Jesus. It's a book that was written from a father to a son, from Solomon to his son, a book that was written to let him know how you can be wise, how you can trust and follow the Lord in this life. And so it's a book that we can really see a lot from. It's a book that we can glean a lot of knowledge and wisdom. And there's somebody that gets talked about in the book of Proverbs very consistently. It's this person in Proverbs that's called the sluggard. The sluggard, according to Proverbs 26, is one who puts his hand in a ditch, but he's too lazy to actually bring his hand back up to his mouth. And so he's too lazy to do that. He's so lazy that he refuses to get up and go to work. And he says, "Hey, there's a lion waiting to devour me outside, and so I'm not going to go to work." And he's just a lazy character, right? And you see him all throughout the book of Proverbs. This man called the sluggard, this man who is lazy. And the reality is that when it comes to our assignments, this is an important character for us to pay attention to, because if there's any area that God has called us to lead and shepherd and steward well, any assignment that God has given us that we are not focusing on or not paying attention to, or we're struggling to show up at it, it's probably because not because we do too much in other areas, but because we are a sluggard in some of those other areas. The issue for somebody who calls themselves a workaholic is not necessarily that they spend too much time at work or that they are addicted to work. The deeper issue is that they're a sluggard at home, or they're a sluggard in some other places in their life. Somebody who's considered a workaholic might just be somebody who is lazy in other areas of their life. And so the reality is we have to be people who realize that God has given us certain assignments, church, with our family, our health, our job, our work, and we need to have those places in order. We need to have boundaries. We need to have priority. We need to be able to prioritize certain things about our lives. We need to live in a purposeful and a priority-driven way. And in order to do this, we have to understand our assignments. And so, like we said, identity is who you are. Assignments is what God has called me to do. Identity doesn't change. Assignments do change. Assignments must be held loosely. They're about doing. Your identity is the foundation for understanding and accomplishing your assignments. And so what are these assignments? These, like I said, are anything God has entrusted you or called you to do. The domains that God has called you to steward, to shepherd, to work, to keep. And typically they fall under self, church, family, and work. And so we need to identify what these God-given assignments are. We also need to look at, are we spending time on things that God hasn't called us to do? Are we spending time on assignments that God hasn't called us to do? Are we sacrificing God-given assignments for things that God hasn't given us to do? And so we have to live in a priority-driven, a purpose-driven way. And the way that we do that, first and foremost, is we have to know what assignments, what are these things that God has called us to do. And so what I want you to do is, in just a moment, I want you to pause this video and I want you to write down the assignments that God has given you. Everything that God has called you to do, I want you to just write it down. Go ahead and pause the video now. Take time and just on a sheet of paper or on your phone or somewhere, write down the things that God has called you to do. All right, now that you're back, some things that I wrote down. A husband to Aaron, dad to Maddie and Jace, a son to my parents, a brother to my sister, the New Spring Greenwood campus pastor, a teacher, a student, a son-in-law, a friend, a small group leader, a men's group leader, the chaplain for the city police department, an advocate in our community. He's given me this body to steward and to take care of my health over. All of those things are things that God has given me and entrusted me with, called me to steward, called me to shepherd, called me to do. You know, another thing that it says in Proverbs is that we need to let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you, to ponder the path of your feet, and all your ways will be sure. Well, the word ponder means to give careful thought and consideration to things. And so God wants us to carefully think about our life, about our plans, about our times, because a thoughtless life is a foolish life. Just like you budget your money so you can tell it where to go and it doesn't tell you where to go, we should budget our time, because you can always make more money. You cannot get more time. We need to stop and ponder. We need to think about what we're called to do, what our assignments are, what our priorities are. And prioritizing our assignments, it is complicated, and priorities might change from week to week or season to season. Sometimes you got to say no to something with your family in order to say yes to something at church, or say no to work and say yes to family, or say no to family and yes to something at work. Priorities can change from time to time, but we need to give careful thought to our priorities, to our calendars, to the things that we're saying yes and no to. We need to ask ourselves question, are there any God-given assignments that you have that are suffering because they're not getting enough attention? Is there anything you need to say no to in order to say yes to other things? Is there any assignments that you know need more specific attention right now? Are there any assignments that you're avoiding right now for any reason? Are there any assignments that are suffering because of the amount of time you're spending on something that God has not called you to? What should be your priorities? We have to budget our time. I had a pastor recently. We were talking about boundaries and how do you set boundaries? How do you know what to say yes to and know what to say no to? And he gave me this illustration. He said, if you're carrying a big bucket and you fill that big bucket with a bunch of big rocks, the reality is the bucket is very heavy and the bucket seems like it's full, but the bucket's really not full. You know why? Because you could take some pea gravel and you could pour it in there, and the pea gravel would find its way around the big rocks and it would find room inside of this bucket. And then you could take sand and you could dump sand, and the little grains of sand would fit down in beneath all of these things and would have room. And then you could take water and you could put water in there, and there would be room for water in there. But the reality is, in that bucket, you've got your big rocks, and then you've got room for pea gravel. You've got room for sand. You've got room for water. Eventually, you're going to run out of room, though. He said, now, if you reversed that and instead you started with the sand and the water and then the pea gravel, and you filled it up with those things, you know what you wouldn't have room for in that bucket? You wouldn't have room for the big rocks. And so many of us, we live our lives this way. We fill our buckets with sand, with water, with pea gravel, with things maybe God hasn't called us to, with things that don't really matter. We fill our buckets with those things, and then we don't have any room left for the big rocks. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that we put the big rocks in there first, that we prioritize the things that are the most important first. And so here's what I want you to do very practically is once a week. I mean, here's the deal. If you have a budget, you do this. You write down what you spent, you write down what you have left, you look at your balance, you look at your bank account, you do all of this stuff in regards to your money. And again, money is something that you can make more of it if you need it. Time is not. Everybody has 168 hours a week. Everybody has the same amount of time. You cannot make more of it. So you need to make sure you're telling your time where to go, not that your time is telling you where to go. So once a week, you need to sit down with your calendar, you need to sit down with your task, and you need to look at the next week. What are my priorities? Are my big rocks in the bucket? Are my priorities getting actual priority? Are those the things I'm saying yes to? Am I saying no to some other things that are pea gravel or sand or water? You need to sit down once a week and you need to spend time budgeting your time and making sure that the big rocks are actually getting in there. You know, we have to make sure that we are taking care of the things that God has called us to. Because here's what I know. So many people that I talk to, even myself all the time, talk about how overwhelmed we are, how busy we are, how we don't have time to do everything that we have. Well, you can't make more time. And here's what I know to be true theologically and biblically. You may not have time to do everything you need to do. You may not have time to do everything you want to do or that you'd like to do, but you do have enough time to do everything that God has called you to do. Because what I know is that if God has called you to do something, he has equipped you to be able to do exactly what he called you to do. If this wasn't true, then we would be saying that God isn't sufficient enough, that he hasn't given me enough to do the things that he has called me to do. So the first step is you need to ask God, what has he called you to do? And you need to say yes to those things and no to the things that God hasn't called you to do. And then you need to sit down and you need to say, okay, here's what God has called me to do. Here are my big rocks. Here are my priorities. I need to make sure those are on my calendar. I need to make sure that those are getting time, that I'm investing time in those things. And then if I have other time, if I want to put some pea gravel, some sand, some water in there, I can. But then I say no to these other things that aren't priorities, that aren't God-given assignments, that aren't things that God has called me to do. And then I'm going to be 100% present wherever I am. If I'm at work, that's a big rock. I'm going to be 100% present there. For my family, that's a big rock. I'm going to be 100% present there. Figure out what your big rocks are. Make sure that your big rocks are getting in the bucket. Make sure that you are prioritizing your time, that you're budgeting your time, that you're telling your time where to go, because God has given you enough time to do everything that he has called you to do. So budget your time, prioritize your time, figure out what your big rocks are, make sure they get in the bucket. Ask God what he has called you to do. Say no to the things that he hasn't called you to do. And let's be people who live our lives on purpose, who live purpose-driven, priority-driven lives, and not lives that just wander around aimlessly doing whatever comes in front of our face in the moment. Let's be people who give thought to our ways, who give thought to our lives, who ask God what he thinks, and then who spend our lives on purpose and on mission with what God has called us to do. Church, work, family, self, and health. Those are extremely important things, big rocks that you need to make sure gets in. And there might be some pea gravel, some sand, some water that you said yes to for a really long time that you need to say no to in this next season so that you can live your life on purpose in the way that God has called you to live it. Let's be that kind of people this week. And as we do, we'll advance the kingdom of God wherever our feet are planted. Love you guys. We'll see you next week.